So I did a video about some of the best budget buys you can get from Thunder Junction a while back, and in that video, I talked about a very particular card with some high praise, and it's this guy right here, Akul the Unrepentant. Now, this guy just looks like Rakdos Lord of Riots to me. I mean, look at him! He's basically the same colors and everything, but let's talk about what he is and what he does and why I really like it. So, for 4 mana, 2 pips of each type, we have a flying and trample creature. He's a scorpion dragon rogue. That is a combination of things. That is a great combination. And he's got the ability to make you sacrifice 3 other creatures to put a creature on the battlefield. Only do this once each turn, and only ever as a sorcery. So, like with a Rakdos Lord of Riots deck, our goal is to make sure that this guy comes on the board quick, and he will discount every single thing we do for the variety of the game. I really think you're going to enjoy this commander, so let's go ahead and get into the core strategy of what we are going to be doing. So one of the downsides of a commander like Akul is you do need to get a bit of an established board to get a payoff for what he's trying to do. Luckily, we've got a few ways to establish a pretty decent board. Let's look at the 10 token cards we are running in this deck that will make it so that we can use this ability as often as possible. Beginning with Ghoulish Procession, when one or more non-token creatures die, that includes our opponent's cards, we can make a 2/2 zombie token. These, of course, have decayed, so we're not going to be swinging with them or using them for any other ability besides our commander's ability. Then we have Lagomos, Hand of Hatred. This card says at the beginning of combat, make a 2/1 red elemental token with trample and haste, and then sack it at the beginning of the next end step. And we can search our library for a card and put it into our hand and shuffle if we have had 5 or more creatures die this turn. Our commander already gives us 3 of those creatures, so it should be fairly easy to make sure that that effect can happen. Otherwise, Lagomos is just giving us a 2/1 red elemental creature token we can use for our commander's ability. Then we have Totentaz, the Swarm Piper. When it or another non-token creature that we have dies, we get to make a 1/1 black creature token. The next part of the effect doesn't matter too terribly much. It just matters that this card is granting us lots and lots of tokens we can use. Carrier Thrall. Whenever it dies, we get to create a colorless Eldrazi Scion token as well to replace it. And the Harried Spearguard, when it dies, will create a 1/1 black creature token to replace it as well. Then we have Anax the Hardened in the Forge. Whenever it or another non-token creature dies, make a 1/1 red Satyr creature token that has text we will never ever use. Then we have Ogre Slumlord. Every time any creature dies, if it's a non-token creature, we make a 1/1 rat that sometimes matters that it has Death Touch. Sometimes, most of the time, it's just going to be a rat that sits here and does its thing. Then we have the Thieving Amalgam at the beginning of every opponent's upkeep. Manifest the top card of their library. Whenever a creature you control but don't own dies, its controller loses 2 life, or its owner loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So we're going to manifest 3 cards per turn cycle and then sacrifice them to our commander while Thieving Amalgam is out, burning everybody for 2 damage, gaining 6 life, and summoning a big creature for free. Speaking of a big creature we're going to summon for free, let me introduce you to Bladewing Deathless Tyrant. We made a video on this one already, so you should know what it does, but Bladewing Deathless Tyrant is amazing in this deck. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, then you get, or a planeswalker, for every creature card in our graveyard, we get to make a 2/2 Zombie Knight with Menace. Sometimes those will be used to lethal people in the face. Most of the time, they will be sacrificed, of course, to our commander so that we can summon more free things. By the way, we're basically going to be using tokens to summon Bladewing Deathless Tyrant anyway, so you see that 7 mana that he's supposed to cost? Ignore that. He's not supposed to cost that. He will never cost that. Not in our deck. And then we have Loyal Apprentice. It has haste, and at the beginning of combat on our turn, if we control our commander, make a 1/1 colorless Thopter token, which we will, of course, be using as sacrifice fodder for our stuff. Also, we have a giant game-winning card we can use as well. Our deck has 41 creatures, so we have a ton of creatures to sacrifice, but with all the tokens we're creating, we should probably talk about this card as well, Lich Knight's Conquest. Sack any number of artifacts, enchantments, and or tokens. Return that many creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. If we are late in the game, this will be a gigantic tempo swing we get to use to flat out destroy our opponents. So we will be able to just ransack everyone with big creatures. But we need to actually have some big creatures to play, so let's talk about which ones we will be using. We've got 6 big payoff creatures who don't have any purpose besides just being the big dirtily boys that we are going to be summoning with our commander, beginning with Etali Primal Storm. When it attacks, exile the top card of each player's library, and then you can cast those cards. There is no game in which Etali does not swing the tempo in your favor, and being able to cast Etali for free in this deck is fantastic. Then we have the Raksha Debaser. When this card attacks, put target creature from a defending player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Raksha Debaser is also a great tempo swing. Every time it swings, we're going to take somebody's best thing and make it our own. Then we have Karvek the Merciless. When an opponent casts a spell, this will burn them for that spell's mana value, or to deal that damage to any target. We can use this to blow up problematic cards on the board, or to punish people for having the audacity to play Magic the Gathering. Then we have Orca Siege Demon, a 7-mana creature with trample, and whenever another creature dies, which we are going to have happen a lot, put a 1/1 counter on Orca. This will happen a ton, and whenever it dies, deal damage divided as you choose equal to its power amongst any number of targets. This card can get so big that it just flat out wins the game on its own, and if it dies, it may just win the game that way as well. And remember, we can just sack him to our commander's ability to force him to die to burn things or kill problematic cards off the board. Then we have Scion of Darkness, a trampling avatar creature that says that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put target creature from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's another copy of Raksha Debaser, and they both cost the same amount of mana. 0. They cost 0. We're just sacking tokens to play these things. Then we have Angrath's Marauders, which says if a source you control would deal damage to a player, it deals double that damage instead. Combine this with cards like Karavek and Orca, and we are going to be eating through people's life like crazy. These cards will do tons and tons of work when they are together. But if our cards die, we do need to make sure that they can come back. So we have a few ways to facilitate that with an 8-card reanimation package as well, beginning with Victimize. It sacrifices one of our creatures, usually a token, to summon 2 creatures from our graveyard. Champion of Stray Souls can sack X creatures to return X target creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield, giving us endless recursion effectively. Then we have Swift Warkite. When it ETBs, put any creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from our hand or graveyard onto the battlefield, give it haste, and then bounce it at the end of the turn. Super simple card, super easy. Sometimes you just need a little creature again. Then we have Vat of Rebirth. Whenever another artifact or creature dies, we get to put an oil counter on this. Pay 3 mana and tap it to reanimate anything from our graveyard by removing 4 oil counters. Reassembling Skeleton gives us super easy access to a recurrable creature we can trigger our token generation with and sack repeatedly to our commander. Altar of Baal can pay 3 mana and tap itself to exile one of our tokens and reanimate any creature from our graveyard. Supernatural Stamina will let us do some funny tricks by telling one of our creatures they get to reanimate automatically when they die, like when they're sacked by our commander. And Dread Return will of course reanimate any creature in our graveyard, and it has a flashback ability that is identical to our commander's ability. Sack 3 creatures, and then the Dread Return will reanimate anything that you so choose. But that's not all. It also turns out that when you're playing a deck like this, you have a bunch of big dirtle creatures, but you really want those cards to come on the battlefield quickly and do their jobs efficiently. So we've got 2 cards that will grant all of our creatures haste. We have Rising of the Day. There's a heavy density of legendaries in the deck with things like Etali, so of course this will give those 1/0, but also gives all of our creatures haste. And then we have Garna the Blood Flame. When it enters the battlefield, return to your hand all creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from anywhere this turn. Other creatures you control have haste. So fun thing we can do with Garna. Super fun thing we can do with Garna. So let's say we've got a bunch of creatures that are super powerful and have really strong enter the battlefield abilities. We can use our commander to sacrifice those 3 creatures, summon Garna, and then Garna will auto-revive every single one of those creatures. Well, put them in your hand in any case, which is still incredibly powerful because it lets us reuse powerful enter the battlefield abilities. And then then of course it will Lord Haste onto everything. So use this to recycle your Enter the Battlefield abilities that we're going to be talking about when we get to the interaction section of the deck. But Garna is an absolute house in terms of being able to save ourselves from losing stuff to a board wipe, or otherwise take all of our stuff that has already done its thing and just reuse those abilities as we go. But that's it for the main strategy of the deck. Let's go ahead and get into what is next. Now, we do need to make sure that we are drawing plenty of cards in this deck. Our commander only works so long as we have options in our hand to drop on the board, and if we don't have tokens to sacrifice in the first place, then we're kind of up shit creek. So how are we going to dig through our deck as fast as possible to make all this happen? Well, let's start with a creature that benefits greatly from our deck's internal strategy, Morbid Opportunist. This is one of the 10 dedicated draw engine cards that are in this deck. When one or more other creatures die, draw a card once per turn. This can potentially draw us 4 cards a turn cycle, and Morbid Opportunist is a very low cost, and it's hard to justify throwing removal at it often, but it almost always has heavy payoff. Then we have Hostile Negotiations, which for 4 mana makes us exile 3 cards on the top of our library twice, and then we get to look at those cards, flip one of those piles up, and hand the 2 piles to an opponent and say, hey, do I get door number 1 that you can see, or door number 2, which is a mystery door? Usually you will benefit from this card. Not only is it paying 4 mana at instant speed to draw 3 cards, which is a great rate of return, but in general, Hostile Negotiations always does really well at causing somebody to get the table mad at them for choosing the wrong door. Then we have Brass's Tunnel Grinder. When it enters the battlefield, discard any number of cards and then draw that many +1. At the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, which is just putting a permanent card into the graveyard, which is super easy to do with our commander, flip it into this Searing Rift card, which is a land that says whenever we cast a permanent spell using mana produced by it, we can discover X, where X is that card's mana value. Brass's Tunnel Grinder is such a fantastic card, and I think people have been sleeping on this for a while. It's a wheel that is at the regular cost of a wheel, 3 mana, that just, for playing your deck normally, will give you this giant tempo swing when it flips. I don't understand why more people aren't playing this thing. Then we have the Harvester of Souls. Anytime another non-token creature dies, you may draw a card. This is the stronger but more volatile version of the Morbid Opportunist. Bear in mind, it is not a May, or it is a May, but it doesn't benefit from your tokens dying. So you are going to have to be careful how you are triggering this ability. You can't just sack tokens to make this guy go off. But Transmogrant Crown is a fantastic card in this deck as well. This says whenever a creature dies, we may draw a card if it was equipped with a Transmogrant Crown. So this will turn any token we have on the board into a +1 as it dies, so long as we've got the mana to dump into it. Then we've got Nullspine Dragon. When it comes into play, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. We can burn our opponent for like 10 damage in this deck easy with our big creatures, and then play Nullspine Dragon for free by sacking a bunch of creatures on our board to our commander's ability, and then just draw a fresh hand if we are out. Card is fantastic, and it's a 7/5 flying otherwise. It's going to help close out games past that point. Then we have Kathofed the Soul Hoarder, another big flyer, and whenever a permanent owned by another player is put to a graveyard, you draw a card and lose 1 life. This one you've got to be even more careful with than the Harvester of Souls, because it can backfire on you greatly. But I think if we're gonna play a Rakdos deck, then we may as well go ahead and do this whole demons cause us interesting scenarios thing. It's fine, it's flavorful, and it's a 6/6 flyer. It's gonna close out the game after time anyway. Then we have the Phyrexian Gargantua. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. It's perfectly reasonable to drop this down with our commander's ability, and then you don't feel bad about sacking it later, because it's not doing a ton for us otherwise. But you can recycle this ability to draw more cards with the abilities we talked about before, like Garna, the Blood Flames ability of throwing this thing back in your hand after its ETB has done its job. Then we have Cut of the Prophets. Draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the amount you pay into its mana cost, minus the 2 black mana. But it's got Casualty 3, so we can sacrifice a creature with power 3 or greater to copy this spell. This will allow us to draw lots and lots of cards, and we're already going to be sacrificing tons of things in the deck anyway, so this is perfectly reasonable to do for us. Then we have Bitter Reunion. We discard a card and draw 2 cards when we play this, so typical Thrill of Possibility style card, but we can also pay 1 to sack this to give all creatures we control haste until end of turn. If you've got a super swingy turn and you need haste on your board and you don't have one of our other haste enablers, we have thrown haste enablers into the draw package. These cards, all in all, should help you dig through the deck fast enough to have everything you need to sack tons of permanents to get easy access to big creatures for 0 mana. But we're not done. We've got some more parts of the deck we got to get into. This section is bound to be huge and beefy because we are a deck that wants to cheat big creatures on the board, and that will make us a target, so we need to be able to dissuade people from targeting us a bunch by getting rid of all of their precious things. So we've got a 15-card removal package that we have access to, beginning with Baleful Beholder. This is one of the few ways that black has to make everybody lose enchantments, so I typically like throwing it in decks that have the ability to cheat him out. He can also give all your creatures menace if he hops on the board and desperately needs to do that, but most of the time we're going to make people lose enchantments. Then we have Dusk Mangler. When it has a thing that says an additional cost to cast it, sack a creature, discard a card, or pay 4 life. Yeah, we ain't doing any of that. This is just a 5/4 that touches the board and makes everybody sack a creature, discard a card, and lose 4 life. Card's amazing. People should run it in more black decks. Then we have Voracious Fellbeast, a 4/4 flyer that makes every opponent sacrifice a creature and then makes us a food token for every creature sacrificed this way. Fantastic freaking card. Then we have Archfiend of Sorrows, a 4/5 flyer that makes every single creature your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn, and it's got Unearth as well. It's basically a board wipe, so yeah, treat it as such. Then we've got Patron of the Vein, enters the battlefield and blows up a creature, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, exile it and put a 1/1 counter on every vampire you control, of which our deck really only has, like, the one. It's got 3 vampires, but let's be honest, they're never going to be on the board with Patron of the Vein. It's mainly here so it can blow up a card and also just be a stacksy piece that prevents people from having infinite loops of graveyard shenanigans, and it's a flyer. It's going to close out games for you. Feed the Swarm blows up enchantments and creatures. Overseer of the Damned blows up a creature, and then every time a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, we make a 2/2 black zombie token. You know exactly what we're going to be doing with that. We're going to be sacrificing the hell out of all those tokens in order to generate more and more free creatures. Then we have my boy, the best creature in Magic the Gathering, the one that you should be playing in more decks if you complain about not being able to remove certain kinds of permanents. You always have access to Meteor Golem, and we're going to be playing him for free, of course. Then we have Bedevil, a 3-mana instant that can blow up an artifact creature or a planeswalker. Magmatic Force, which at the beginning of each upkeep deals 3 damage to any target. This can be used to remove lots of little problematic cards, or it can be used to just slowly close out the game. Then we have Butcher of Malakir. Anytime Butcher or another creature we control dies, each opponent sacks a creature. I hope you understand how brutally evil this is with our commander. We sack 3 creatures to our commander's ability, and Butcher of Malakir is just like, herder, you get to lose your firstborn, and everything else. Then we have Demon of Loathing, a flying trample 7/7. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they have to sacrifice a creature. Warstorm Surge, which says whenever a creature ETBs, we get to deal damage equal to its power to any target. So we are going to be burning all kinds of stuff, or just people's life points, who knows. Rakdos Charm, because if you're playing a Rakdos deck, you might as well shove it in, exile all cards from a person's graveyard, or blow up an artifact, or make a token player suffer by making them lose 1 life for every single token they control. It's not what it really says. It says each creature deals 1 damage to its controller, but the way I worded it is much more accurate to how it feels, let's be honest. Then we have the Cemetery Desecrator, a menace creature that when it enters the battlefield or dies, exile another card from a graveyard. And when you do, you can either remove X counters from target permanent, where X is the value of the card, or make a creature get -X, -X, where X is the mana value of the exiled card. This is doing double duty for us. It's getting rid of a card in a graveyard while also guaranteeing that we can kill a card on the board, and it gets around indestructible because it is a negative ability. So this is doing lots and lots of work for us. Definitely try to recycle this as often as you can to keep reanimation players honest, because we're the only reanimation player at the table allowed to play Magic the Gathering. Let's be fair here. Then we've got two other board wipes you got to talk about. One is Massacre Worm, which gives us another avenue for winning the game. -2 to each creature all your opponents control, and also anytime a creature an opponent controls dies, they lose 2 life. So we can drop this on the board, wipe a bunch of tokens off the board, potentially kill the player who generated all of them, or, you know, another cool thing, we just keep it on the board, and as we're killing things, our opponent just loses all kinds of other stuff. If we are dropping bunches of threatening creatures on the board every turn cycle, then eventually people will have no choice but to remove the Massacre Worm, or just accept that we're summoning too many creatures too easily. Then we have Massacre Girl. Now, Massacre Girl, when she enters the battlefield, give every creature -1/-1. Whenever a creature dies, each creature other than Massacre Worm gets Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Most of the time, when you play Massacre Girl, she just wipes the entire board, because that's how the math works out. If there's one creature on the board that's got 1 toughness, and there's 1 or 2 creatures on the board with 2 toughness, that's basically all you need, and then Massacre Girl will annihilate everything. And remember, we, as the player with Massacre Worm, can just use this to flat out win the game. But Massacre Girl does have the benefit for us of being a token deck, so she generally will see tons and tons of tokens to get her ability off and ruin everybody's day. Massacre Girl is amazing, and she's not even underrated. Everybody plays Massacre Girl, let's be honest. But with that all said, that's all for this section. Of course, no Magic the Gathering deck would be complete without mana of some kind, unless you're playing Affinity, in which case you really don't need mana. Mana's kind of a myth to the Affinity and Cheerios players. But for everybody else, there's Ramp. Mere Convert 2 mana creature that can let us pay 2 life to add a mana of any color. It's also got Toxic to threaten people with a bad time. Then we've got Charcoal and Fire Diamond. These tap for our deck's mana. Ornithopter of Paradise taps for our mana of any color. Commander's Sphere can tap for a mana of any color that our commander's identity has, while also letting us draw a card if we need it. Rakdos Signet taps for our colors. Arcane Signet taps for our colors. Wayfarer's Bauble can be cracked to get any piece of land from our deck that's basic onto the battlefield. Honored Heirloom is the rainbow rock that goes in every deck. We can use this to add a mana of any color and also exile a card from somebody's graveyard at instant speed. Use this to make the Marin of Clan Neltoth player cry. That's the purpose of this card. Then we have Madi, the Emporium Master. Madi's really cool. At the beginning of your end step, make a treasure token for every creature that died this turn. You know, the only thing our deck does, which it just makes creatures die. Whether it's creatures our opponents have or creatures we have, all those creatures die. Not one of them gets to live. It's the entire purpose behind our existence. So Madi is doing lots and lots of work in that regard. But we still have to talk about the lands in this deck. And for that, we are running 8 fetching lands, 9 dual lands, and 18 basic lands. The fetching lands we are running are Grixis Panorama, because it does come to play untapped and can be sacked for our deck's colors. Escape Tunnel, which is just another copy of Terramorphic Expanse, which is just another copy of Evolving Wilds. Shire Terrace, which is just another copy of Grixis Panorama, as is Promising Vein. Then we have Myriad Landscape, which taps for a colorless, or lets us get 2 basic lands from our deck and throw them on the battlefield tapped, or Ash Barrens, which lets us basic land cycle it, or just use it for mana if we need to. Every single land in this deck that produces colorless mana can fetch colored mana because our commander desperately needs it. Then we have Tainted Peak, which can come into play untapped and gives us colorless mana unless we have a swamp. Rakdos Cranarium, which gives us both of the colors of our deck as a bounce land. Shadowblood Ridge, which is a wonderful filter land to turn any colorless mana we happen to have into colored mana. Smoldering Marsh comes into play untapped if you have 2 or more basic lands, because it is a tango land. Foreboding Ruins comes into play untapped if we can reveal a mountain or swamp, which Smoldering Marsh is one of those. Command Tower and Exotic Orchard for obvious reasons, Temple of Malice, which lets us scry 1, and it's not a card I typically would run, but in a deck that doesn't have any colorless pips in the commander, sometimes I'm okay running a Temple to basically force the mana situation for us. Then we have Canyon Slow, which can be cycled while also being a swamp or mountain. It's our only tapped land besides the Temple that I feel like I'm getting an allergic reaction to the longer that I stare at it. Then we have 11 swamps and 7 mountains due to the makeup of our deck, which, if you see, to figure out why we make the mana decisions that we do here on this channel, the deck has a 66 representation of black mana pips with a 34 representation of red ones. So we do lean higher on black mana. I highly recommend using Moxfield to look at the mana base of your deck and figure out if you're running the right amount of colors, the right distribution of colors for what your deck is doing. A lot of problems in the deck building process can be solved if you do that. But since we are done talking about mana, there is another very important thing we got to talk about, and that is how you would upgrade this deck if you wanted to shove a little more money into it. Now, as you're upgrading the deck, you want to make sure that you still have an ample amount of token generation along with the ability to grant haste to your creatures and, of course, the ability to function as a, aggro-y, dirtily deck. You are trying to get big creatures on the board for free, and you are trying to hit people with them. But, again, they are not fast, goblin-y aggro creatures. So, like, a Lightning Greaves and a Swiftfoot Boots obviously would be some of the upgrades I would go for. But if I were to pick the very first card I would aim for over anything at all, it would probably be Anger. This is a super easy card to get in our graveyard, and we will almost always have a mountain. This will give all of our creatures haste, and that is just a super important thing to have in a deck like this. Unfortunately, at $3.50, it doesn't make it into the deck in the $15 version. Urabrask the Hidden's another one you can add in if you so choose. It has a fun Staxy ability on top of it, which is kind of neat as well. Archon of Cruelty is one of my personal favorites, and we are getting a reprint of it in the new Modern Horizons 3 precons, so look forward to having access to a cheaper Archon of Cruelty soon. Speaking of cheaper cards, Noxious Gear Hulk is a card that I wasn't able to quite fit in this deck with its budget already being a little over $15 to begin with, but life gain is super important in decks that are in Rakdos because you tend to spend a lot of life in general. Jadar is also a fantastic include as it does generate tokens at a decent rate for us. I'd also probably throw in not one, not two, but all 3 Sheoldreds, as they all have some way of either controlling the board, reanimating en masse if you flip this particular Sheoldred, or just closing out games. Every single Sheoldred is a house that needs to be dealt with very, very quickly. Phyrexian Altar would be the first altar I'd go for if I was working with an unlimited budget, because our commander is hard to summon otherwise, so being able to turn our tokens into mana, and specifically colored mana, is kind of important to me. I'd also add a Skull Clamp to add on to the Transmogrant Crown idea that we're already working with. Crowded Crypt would be a super good upgrade to, say, Charcoal Diamond, because it does give us a win con attached to it with the ability to summon a huge army of zombies late into the game. We can also use those zombies for our commander's ability too if we need to. Keep also summons a lot of red kobolds for us, and it can be done at instant speed right before our turn begins. Keep is a fantastic add and one of the few colorless lands I would add in as well. Grave Pact on top of the Butcher of Malakir will give us the ability to keep everybody else under control if we don't have to worry about a budget. Grave Titan is also a great way to generate tokens, and it comes down for free in our deck anyways. And then we have Ophiomancer. Just like Jadar, this is summoning lots and lots of tokens we can use to just keep ourselves in the game. And there's a lot of other upgrades you could choose as well, but these are some of the ones I would try to look for. And, well, that does it for our deck list for a Cool. I think you'll really enjoy this deck if you haven't already. If you're a fan of aristocracy-style strategies and you like cheating creatures in with reanimation-style effects, Cool is great for that in being able to just give you another kind of a foil to Rakdos Lord of Riots and the ability to cheat big creatures out onto the board. I think he's a fantastic commander. The only downside for him is that he doesn't cast the card, so we can't use him as like an Eldrazi commander, though that would be kind of fun. Just sack a bunch of Eldrazi Scions to summon the big Eldrazi. That would actually be really flavorful if that was possible, but it doesn't work well in here because we wouldn't get the Eldrazi's cast triggers. But I guess there's still a deck idea there if you can avoid things like the Eldrazi Titan's cast triggers. Either way, let me know if there's anything you would add into the deck, and if there's anything you would cut out for the upgrades, or for any upgrades that you particularly would want in there. What do you think of this commander? Do you think this is a decent job at building him for a hyper budget? Let me know all that in the comment section below. I love seeing the feedback from all of you, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to get as many $15 decks out recently with everything else that's been going on, but I'm trying to get back into the saddle of that. So thank you all for watching my stuff. I appreciate every one of you that comes out and sees my content, and with all that said, guys, thank you for watching. Deck lists in the description, the upgrades are in the consideration section, and as always, all insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here. They would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.